But of course, when I'm talking about colleges, when we're talking about what's going on in schools at this time, it brings me to yet a different idea, something that's not quite as fun, something that's not quite as interesting. And that has to be the S.A.Ts. Now, I'm looking at, and for those who are just listening to this by the podcast, the audio only, this is an article from the New York Times. It says, "Your questions about the new adversity score on the S.A.T. answered." And this was published on May 17th, yesterday. And for people who are not aware, so just to bring everyone up to speed, there's this new idea that's running around the academic circles that because the question of whether or not race can be considered as a factor for admission into schools, since that's being questioned and that's being brought up and it's going before the Supreme Court, the schools are looking for another way. And for their gender identity politics, their agenda that we see on every college campus across the nation, they're looking for another way to promote that. And so their answer is they want to go with an adversity score. So when you take your S.A.T., you get an adversity score. And I am livid. I hate this. I think this is a horrible idea. This is one of the most insulting things that I've seen since they decided to say that Ebonics is actually a language and it should be taught in schools, which is stupid and insulting. I think it's as insulting as the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. I think it's as insulting as, affirmative action. Because it's insulting to the people who are involved with it. It means, by definition, when the government comes out with these programs, when we see institutions come out with these programs that say that you are so pitiful, that you are so deprived, so deficient, so inferior, that they have to come up with a new category, a new way to insert you into their programs, into life, into society, to take care of you because you can't do it yourself. I find that insulting. And that is inherent. That is inherent in each of these programs, whether it's the Equal Rights Amendment, whether it's gay rights, whether it's the affirmative action. All of these programs are built on the premise that the people they're trying to, quote, help, end quote, are inferior, that they can't do it on their own. And I am sorry, that is an insult. That is wrong. And we should never buy into that. I don't believe in that. I don't believe it's correct at all. Just because you may be poor, you may be black, Hispanic, Asian, any group, I don't care what it is, gay, straight, transgender, whatever it is, that doesn't make you inferior. That doesn't make you in need of the government's help, the full force and might of the government pushing and mandating that you have to be accepted because otherwise you couldn't be, because you're too inferior to be accepted. That is inherent when you accept things like affirmative action, Equal Rights Amendment, when you accept these ideas, the S.A.T., the adversity scores, you are inherently accepting the fact that they are saying that you are incapable of being able to live your life, that you are inferior. And I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I reject it. It's part and parcel of the gender and identity politics that we see coming from the far left and the fringe left. I reject that. How dare you say that? I know that that's not what they say in their advertising, in their commercials, in their proponents out there. They don't say this, but that is the meaning of these things. Stop for a second and think about what these things say. You can't do it, so the government must do it for you because you are too inferior to do it. And I'm sorry, I reject that. I reject that wholeheartedly. So I'm very upset about this S.A.T. Adversity score that's now being instituted to try and make things more fair. And in the article, the New York Times goes on to say, some of the neighborhood factors that are going to be used for this adversity score are median family income, percentage of households in poverty, percentage of single-parent households, percentage of vacant housing units, percentage of adults without a high school degree, percentage of adults without a college degree, percentage of adults with agricultural jobs, and the unemployment and crime rates. Okay, I want you to think about this. And by the way, they also have a detailed data link which shows the college board who put this together. And these are some of the people who were involved in putting together Common Core, one of the bigger failures in education across the nation. And they have the full list of all the things that are measured from the neighborhood and your high school. Now, this has nothing to do with the individual student themselves. It has nothing to do with the student who took the S.A.T. and whether or not they have been adversely affected. This isn't an individual thing. This is a mandate from institutions telling you that just because you exist, and just because you exist in a certain place, you are inferior. I reject that completely. This is insulting. This has nothing to do with education whatsoever. Okay? And I know people want to say, well, Mike, you just don't understand. Yeah, I understand very clearly. Let me ask you something. Let's think about this for a second. What in the world does the unemployment rate in your area have to do with you being able to do 2 + 2 = 4? What in the world does the crime rate in area have to do with you being able to read? I mean, quite simply, nothing. There is no correlation. There is no connection there. Oh, well, you're in an area that has high crime. I grew up in an area with high crime, and did that mean I couldn't read? Of course I could. Because reading a book has nothing to do with whether or not a crackhead is running around out in the street. Unless you're deciding to run around out in the street with the crackhead. And I expect that if you're running around in the street with the crackhead, you're not reading a book. But that's a choice. You don't have to do that. You don't have to be with the crackhead. And if you're running around with a bunch of crackheads, 9 out of 10, you're going to be a crackhead too. Let's be honest about that. So what's that got to do with anything? Unemployment? People are unemployed for lots of reasons. It has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. We've seen people, remember in 2008, where we had massive, rampant, 10, 12% unemployment throughout the nation? Some of the highest levels of unemployment since the Great Depression. And people are trying to say that somehow if you are unemployed or live in a household where people are unemployed, somehow that means you're less intelligent. Really? What does that have to do with anything? How does whether you are employed or not have anything to do with whether or not you're intelligent? That is an insult. Everyone should be insulted by that because it has nothing to do with anything. Let me ask you, when you're looking at whether or not you're in a single-parent household, what does that have to do with you being able to understand science? Quite honestly, what does it have to do with it? I grew up in a single-parent household. My mother did a wonderful job of raising us. Guess what? I was a huge, avid fan of science. I read all the time. I went to college and I studied chemistry. Much of my scientific knowledge came from my love of science early on in my life. And I grew up in a single-parent household. I have many friends who grew up in single-parent households, also are knowledgeable about science. I know people who are now adults. They're knowledgeable about science, and they happen to be single parents. What does that have to do with someone's knowledge and the ability to convey that knowledge? It has nothing to do with it. It is an excuse. It is an excuse to try and promote a gender and identity politics. It is a way to say that someone is inferior and that they need the help of a government or an institution because they cannot do it for themselves. And if you accept that, you are always beholden to that institution, to that political group, to that government for everything in your life. You give up your freedom, your individual choice, because you say, I can't do it myself. I'm not good enough. And if you say that you are not good enough, you give them the power of your life, and you are then and forever afterwards only limited to what they are willing to let you do. That's worse than slavery, in my view, because it's willful. You willfully give up your right to this other institution, this political group, these fringe ideas, and say that you are incapable of doing anything other than what they have decided you are able to do. You are no longer an agent of your own life. You are dependent on their direction for your life. That is insulting. And I reject that wholeheartedly, completely. I will never accept that. And I don't think anyone should ever accept that. Let me say that again. The S.A.T. and this adversity score, this attempt to define people by categories and ideas that have nothing to do with an individual, that have nothing to do with the ability of an individual to convey whether or not they have knowledge, is insulting and it is demeaning. And everyone should be upset about this. This does not do anyone any favors. You are not helping someone. To say that to say that there are vacant houses. I live in a city where 40% of the houses, roughly, are empty. That's because the population left. Okay, this region, Binghamton in particular, Broome County, used to be a hub of manufacturing back in the 80s. And manufacturing escaped New York because of the high taxes, bad regulation, bad government. And manufacturing left. And so the area went from about 80,000 people to 40,000. And if you don't count the illegal aliens in the region, it's actually somewhere around 38,000 people. But remember, the houses that were here for 80,000 people are still here. The houses didn't go away. So you have a huge number of abandoned, empty, and some of them blighted houses. Does that mean that the kids in this region somehow are better or worse than children in any other region? Students here are worse or better off than students anywhere else just because there is a higher percentage of houses that are vacant because industry changed, because government failed, because government policies drove people out? New York State has lost about 1.5 million people, most of them from upstate New York. And you have to ask yourself, when people are leaving these areas, if your neighbor, let's really think about what the S.A.T. is saying here. If your neighbor moves and there's no one in that house, if the apartment next door to you or the house next door to you is empty, how does that make you smarter, more capable, or more knowledgeable? Does it add or subtract in any way? Because the honest answer is no, it does not. Whether or not you have a neighbor next door does not make you smarter or dumber, more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable. We have to think about this. This is insulting. If you think I'm wrong, tell me. Tell me how that's not correct. Please explain to me how whether or not there is someone next door to you, in a house next door to you, a neighbor, makes you smarter or not smart. How whether or not someone is unemployed in your region, not even in your household, in your region, in the area you live in, if someone is unemployed, please explain to me how that affects the ability for you as an individual to add, subtract, and to write a sentence. Please do explain that to me. I really would love to hear this, because the only answer I get out of this is insulting, it is demeaning, and it is wrong. And it does not help anyone, but it does promote a gender and identity politics fringe mentality that is built on the idea that you are not smart enough to run your own life, and some elitist is. And we should reject that completely. We should all reject that completely. But as you heard the little bell go off. It's time for a quick break. So just bear with me and we'll be right back in just a moment.